Amongst some developed countries, it may be impossible to pass any climate legislation without a BCA regime, was a thought that he observed. And he wished to add a bit of South African perspective, which is, of course, South Africa is a country with high GDP ratio and carbon-intensive industries. Not surprisingly, this issue is therefore of concern to South Africa, that those sectors may be vulnerable to such measures. 40% of South Africans' emissions are due to the export of carbon-intensive goods, not to domestic consumption. That's a pretty high ratio of export to domestic emissions. Mining and manufacturing sectors, they may thus find that they are attracting a significant amount of border taxation if an effective carbon pricing regime is not implemented domestically in South Africa. An interesting allusion I couldn't help but notice. The South African Renewables Initiative calculates the potential cost of EU and US border tax adjustments for South African exporters could rise to over $720 million per annum, based on current exports. Interestingly, Brendan did not intend to draw any further conclusions other than noting this and making some very polite comments about the panel, together with some questions he would like us to consider. Is there a role for border measures to address emissions? What alternative tools exist to prevent carbon leakage? How to best measure embodied carbon in traded goods? And is the concept of embodied carbon or the practice of border measures compatible with a multilateral system of trade? I am well aware that there have been some considerable discussions already on some of those topics. Now I'm in the role of chair, I intend to return to some of those questions in the discussion period, but I think you all know the underlying issues at stake. Without taking more time from my role or indeed standing in for Brendan, could I invite the first speaker to the podium to present, Graham Sinden.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Graham Sinden. I'm Executive Director at Climate Strategies. Climate Strategies is a Europe-based research network that considers issues in the area of climate and energy policy and sort of bridges that gap between excellent research and policymaker demands in this area. I'm going to be talking today, if I can drive the machine.
And up to 5 for the respondents.
I'm going to be talking today about embodied emissions in trade. The first couple of slides, I only have 4 slides, I don't want to bore you to death with them. The first couple of slides are just looking at the numbers behind this, the flows that exist at the moment in trade between countries and the effect that this has on a production versus a consumption view of emissions. I'm sure that's language that many of you are familiar with, but I'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then the second couple of slides are dealing more with the border measures area of what is possible, what's the rationale for it, what are the options, etc. So this first slide is a very high-level view of the world. It's taken from a paper that myself and colleagues published a couple of months ago, which itself drew heavily on research that the Carbon Trust had carried out. And this looks at the flow of embodied emissions in trade between 10 super regions in the world, just to keep it simple. The model itself actually deals with 113 different countries and regions, but here it's grouped into 10 super regions. And what we find is that the top 10 out of the possible 100 flows between the 10 regions here account for more than half of the embodied emissions in trade in this particular view of the world. The top 3 of those flows of emissions, which is China to the US, China to Europe, and China to Australasia, there's a bit of a theme there. They all originate in China, and that accounts for half of the emissions that you see indicated in the flows with these arrows. Overall, the flow of embodied emissions in trade between countries is equal to around 1/4 of global CO2 emissions based on 2004 data. So this is a fairly significant amount of emissions that are flowing from country or between countries and ultimately from producer countries to consumer countries. So this is what I think of as the dynamics of the system. Where are the flows going? Where are these major transfers of emissions embodied in trade? This next slide is what I see as the outcome of that, the implications of these flows for how we consider emissions at a country level. So this slide does take a little bit of explanation, but it is worth it. The x-axis represents global CO2 emissions in 2004, total global emissions of CO2 in 2004. And the width of each country bar represents that country's contribution to the production of CO2 emissions globally. So China and the USA have the widest bars because they are the world's largest country producers of CO2. And when I say a producer, I mean these are the emissions that are arising from industrial activity taking place within the territorial limits of those countries. On the y-axis, you see a percentage scale. And that percentage scale shows the relative impact of the import and export of emissions embodied in trade on each country's consumption emissions. So I was talking before about production emissions, what's being produced from a country. Consumption emissions is looking at the emissions that arise globally because of the consumption of goods and services within a country. So living in the UK, as I do, if I buy a foreign-made car, the emissions under our current system are allocated to the country of assembly of the car and the country of production of the steel and the country where the materials were mined. From a consumption perspective, all those emissions associated with creating the car that I ultimately consume would be allocated to the UK because that is the place where consumption took place. And so we can see here that there are some fairly significant differences between countries. The most obvious one is that there are net exporters and there are net importers of emissions. If we take the UK, which sits a long way to the left on this scale, it sits at plus 34%. This means that the emissions that arise globally because of the goods and services that the UK demands, that the UK consumes each year, are 34% higher than the emissions that actually arise from industrial activity in the UK. If we take China as the classic alternative example, roughly 1/4 of the emissions that arise from industrial activity in China each year are associated with the export of goods and services that are finally consumed in other countries. So in this chart, countries on the left are net importers of emissions, countries on the right are net exporters of emissions. There are actually two things that drive that percentage figure on the far left. One is the absolute amount of emissions that a country is importing or exporting. The other one, particularly for the countries on the far left of this graph, is the carbon intensity of domestic activity. So you can see Sweden is tucked over there a long way towards the left. Norway is in there as well. These countries are not there because they are major importers of CO2 emissions. They are there because any net import of CO2 embodied in trade into those countries is going to look relatively large compared to what's happening domestically because those economies have very low carbon intensities of domestic activity. So it's good to keep in mind those two drivers. One is absolute flows, one is the carbon intensity of domestic production. So that's the picture of these global flows. That's what's happening. You've seen the flows between the countries. You've also seen how this affects country position when you shift from a production to a consumption view. So, what role for border mechanisms? Well, there are a large variety of options that are available to address these sorts of things. A global deal is an obvious one. These flows are actually not relevant if there is consistent and universal pricing of emissions globally, because we then have confidence that the cost of these emissions has been accounted for at some point in wherever these emissions were ultimately produced. But we don't have a global scheme. There are sectoral approaches. We've discussed, there are also linking proposals, linking between schemes, and border mechanisms or border measures. And when we start thinking about these border measures, there are a few things that I think it's useful to keep in the backs of our minds. Is this a policy imperative or is it a policy option? It is not essential that we tackle these cross-border flows of emissions, and it's not essential that we tackle them through border measures. It is an option, and it is an option that policymakers may choose to consider. In fact, it's a fairly complex option, and there are a number of different ways in which it could actually be implemented. And so I personally feel there is a lot of work to be done at the moment to understand what are the pros and cons and the implications of different designs and different approaches to border mechanisms. Is this anti-trade or is it just implicit in trade? In the first two slides that I showed, I was talking about the magnitude of these flows. It's important not to confuse that with high magnitudes are bad. That's not the message. The message here is not that these flows must be reduced. The message is the other way around. At the moment, these flows are occurring. They're a natural result coming out of the trade of goods and services between countries. But at the moment, they don't reflect a price of carbon, or a very limited amount of them reflect a price of carbon. It's not about trying to address the magnitude of them. It's about trying to address the pricing of them, representing the cost of these emissions. And that really comes into the third point as well, to be reduced or to be recognised. In an ideal world, thank you, Michael. In an ideal world, the flow of these emissions would represent an optimal allocation of emissions and the cost of emissions, just as it represents the allocation of other costs and resources within the production and consumption systems globally. To cover off in 1 minute, principles for border mechanisms. Equivalent coverage. From an EU perspective, the EU is not in a very strong position if it starts talking about border measures for emissions that it is not pricing internally. That would create obvious conflicts. Mutual recognition. If other countries are pricing emissions, then that needs to be recognised, and then you start to see the relationship between linkage and border mechanisms. And non-discriminatory. This is not about addressing the emissions arising from the steel production sector in China or Japan or Australia. It's about addressing emissions from steel consumption, the emissions that are driven by steel consumption. Very important. I have 15 seconds left to address this. And I'm quite happy to come back to this in the questions. I will cover it off by saying I don't believe there is a universally agreed approach to border mechanisms. There are different designs out there, there are different policy designs, and there are different implementation approaches. Some of those policy designs imply financial flows and financial recycling. Some of them don't, and that comes with some very different political viewpoints. The implementation approach, and this was touched on in the last session with a discussion about best available technology, worst available technology, fixed global average, rising global average, etc. It's important to recognise that there are different outcomes associated with these, different environmental outcomes and different outcomes in terms of cost and effectiveness. Given the time constraints, I'm going to leave it there, having opened up the Pandora's box, and hand it over to our second speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Graham. I think it is probably most useful if I go straight through the speakers, unless there are direct questions for clarification. Is there anything that Graham presented that people didn't understand and think could be quickly resolved with a question? That's perfect, Graham. Thank you. I'd like to turn now to Hector Pollitt from Cambridge Econometrics.
Thank you. My name's Hector Pollitt. I'm from Cambridge Econometrics. I lead the international modelling team there. I'm an economist by background, and talking about carbon leakage today with the interaction between climate policy and economics. There's been a lot of discussion so far, very good discussion, about policy and the details of some of the policies that might be implemented. I'm going to take a bit of a step to the side of that to talk about how these policies can be assessed, particularly quantitatively. So I'm going to cover really three things in my slides. I only have 3 slides. Some of the methodologies that are available and are being used or potentially could be used. A short summary of studies that have been carried out recently by myself and colleagues, and then very briefly the results from that. And I was going to wrap up with some conclusions, but much of it's already been covered. So that should help on the timing anyway. The assessment approaches, quite a wide range available. Each one comes with its own built-in assumptions and pros and cons that go with that. I think for a comprehensive policy assessment, we would always suggest that a combination of these policies is used so that the results are not dependent on any one set of assumptions. But it's good to go through the range there. Clearly, we're looking at a very complex issue here, and the level of detail that we're going into is also important in terms of sectoral coverage, how big are the sectors, how far do you go, and the geographical coverage, we're looking at 1 country, 2 countries bilaterally, or the whole world. And then other dimensions such as timing and the actual scope of the policy, how far are we going. So I jotted down a rough hierarchy, as I've called it, trying to go from the simplest to the most complex. That's not to say that qualitative is necessarily the most simplest, but it could be. I think that qualitative assessment could be broken up much further to include, say, case studies, interviews, questionnaires, that type of thing. But it's a very important part of the overall process. Then the most simple quantitative type analysis, I've just called it simple data analysis, but back of the envelope calculation type thing. Sort of thing that if you need a quick response, for example, during a negotiating process, something that can be achieved very quickly. Medium level of robustness, I would say, to that. And then moving down towards getting in the more academic type studies and actually going into real policy analysis. Going beyond the most observable traits and trying to extract more meaning from them. I put up econometric assessment as an example of that. So we have data available for particular activities, and we try to work out unobservable behavioural responses from that data. That requires more time, and of course requires more data, but we get an additional level of learning coming from that. And then finally, probably most complex of all, was when the models get involved, and there are various modelling techniques available. 2 in particular to focus on, I think, is the partial models, which look at one sector in a very high level of detail and can include the different production functions available, like we saw for steel in the previous session. They're very good and very detailed for what they do. And then the general models, which are more economics focused, and they do not have the same level of details for the sectors, but they include all the sectors together. And that's very important for when looking at all these interlinkages, not just between countries, but between sectors as well. Final bullet point, as I said, the complexity of these approaches often reflects the complexity of the problem that we're dealing with. As we move further down that list, then they become a lot more complicated. And that's important not just for the actually carrying out the assessment, but in communicating the results as well. So I just put up a summary of a list of studies, and this is only what's been carried out. Yep, that's what's been carried out at Cambridge Econometrics by colleagues. We started off several years ago, just as this issue was becoming rising up the agenda, with a research project where these methods were being developed. That's since moved on, and we've moved on into a more policy relevant set of scenarios. But As well as that, the methodology itself has changed to deal with what we're looking at. And you can see that even ourselves within our company, we've applied different methods for some of these studies, really depending on how detailed we're going into the sectoral level. The modelling is great because it links everything together, but if you want to see a sector 4-digit or lower, then it's not possible, it's not feasible. So ideally, even ourselves, we combine these to go, methods to go together to give an overall and very comprehensive overview. But different people have different approaches, and I think this is one of these things where there is no right or wrong answer. And my final slide on the findings, much of this was covered in the last session, and pleased to say there's quite a high level of agreement, I think, between these findings. Some very specific sectors may be at risk of significant carbon leakage. That's mainly an outcome from the econometric analyses. The ones that are most likely to fall into that category are very much those that have been described already, particularly steel, aluminium, cement. The obvious question, which has been touched upon but only discussed in some detail so far, is how do you determine which these sectors are? It was mentioned earlier that the EU criteria were too wide. I'm told 164 sectors fell into that category, which is clearly more than the handful that were being discussed earlier. The criteria that have been used so far, trade linkages, important, but it must be more than that. Clearly carbon content needs to be included, and that's both direct and indirect, which generally is taken to be the electricity part of it. But there are also other criteria which are much more difficult to quantify, and I just jotted down a couple, such as clustering, access to markets, really how likely businesses are to relocate and whether it's possible. And then there are some other aspects that are not there in the historical data but could be there in the future. For example, cement has been quoted. If the carbon price becomes high enough that it starts to outweigh the transport costs, then we may start to see leakage, even though that has not happened to a great extent already. The second point about the whole economy impacts, this generally comes from modelling, so when all the sectors are linked together, this partly reflects the fact that the sectors that are at least at most risk of leakage, there are relatively few of them, and in economic terms they're quite small. There are other things rolled into that as well. The sectors at risk tend to have quite short supply chains, so the feedbacks don't go that far through the economy. And there are also other aspects such as cost pass-through rates and the degree of substitution available. But very consistent finding that when you go up to the macro level, and that's both in terms of GDP but also in terms of jobs and employment, we don't see that big effects from our results. And then finally, trying to link this back to policy, and I'm not going to go too far on this, it seems to be a reasonable conclusion from this analysis that really the policies should be sector specific, should be based on that. We don't go into how feasible that might be, but we have considered various things such as free allowances and the border adjustments, and we put them through the modelling. But again, as I say, it's really when you go into this level of detail, we provide one option, but there are other ways of looking at this as well, and they need to be combined. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hector. And again, any immediate questions of clarification, not discussion? Okay, great. Our third speaker is Diane Simiu, who's the Director General for Energy and Climate.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Graham, for this opportunity to share with you the French proposal for an instrument to prevent carbon leakage. So my name is Diane Simiu. I'm the head of the Carbon Markets Unit at the Directorate General for Energy and Climate at the French Ministry of Environment. So I was going to, explain for those of you who might happen not to know it, what carbon leakage is, but I guess by that time it should be clear to all of you. So this leaves me with a little more time to discuss something else, which is referring to what Michael said in his introduction on behalf of Brendan Vickers. I heard that carbon leakage was a problem of competitivity of European or other industries, that it was a question of losing market shares. There's one thing that I would like to make clear from the beginning, is that from our point of view, we approach carbon leakage as an environmental issue. Indeed, it's not just about losing market share, it's also about those emissions associated with the production of industrial goods in Europe, for instance, moving to other regions of the world. And what would mean is that our domestic policies to reduce industrial emissions would be less efficient. Therefore, in our view, it is necessary to address carbon leakage so as to ensure that our domestic policies are efficient. This is, I think this is a very important point to make from the beginning. And also, if I can afford one more comment about what my fellow previous speakers have discussed, Hector Pollitt mentioned that if you look at the economy-wide scale, carbon leakage might not be a very important problem. However, Graham's presentation suggests that a quarter of all emissions are actually embodied in goods that are traded. So I think that's an interesting paradox that I think maybe we should discuss further when we during the Q&A. So maybe I can now move to my presentation now that I've finished discussing others. But so the idea behind the French proposal for carbon inclusion mechanism, we call it, is that currently the EU ETS directive, so the European Emissions Trading Scheme directive for phase 3, mainly addresses carbon leakage through free allocations. It also, however, opens the possibility for other actions to address carbon leakage. Now, we think that free allowances are not necessarily always the best solution, and also that there might not always be sufficient to effectively prevent carbon leakage. And so this is why we have imagined this additional scheme, which could either be used as a complement to free allocation or be used as a substitute. And the idea is really to have a level playing field between European manufacturers and importers. So basically the idea is that importers would be asked to surrender an amount of allowances which would be equivalent to what an EU producer would have to surrender. And so if you don't have any information about that importer's the embodied emissions in the product, you would treat it just as an average EU producer would be treated. So they would need to surrender a quantity of allowances which corresponds to the quantity of product they have times the difference between EU average specific emissions for that product and the EU benchmark, which is used to calculate free allowances. So it's a little complicated, but really what you need to remember is that if you don't have any information about an importer's emissions, you treat them as if they were an average EU producer. And however, if they can prove that they're better, that they're more environmentally virtuous than an average EU producer, then they would not have, they would only have to surrender allowances up to the difference between their emissions and the benchmark. And assuming they're better than the EU benchmark, which is pretty ambitious, then they wouldn't have to surrender any allowances at all in that case. So by then you're probably thinking that this sounds great on paper, but this is impossible to do in practice. And well, a lot of people think that. So we've done work to try to demonstrate that maybe this is not quite as administratively complicated as it may sound. Basically, we've done work with French customs, and we have found out a lot of things which I didn't know when I started working on this. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that at customs, there is a lot of information which is collected. You have information on who is the importer, what type of product, what quantity, where does it come from. You even have extra fields for different certificates of different types. And what I didn't know is that every importer has a unique identification number, which is the same for all of the EU. And all the information that is collected at customs is actually centralized in one big EU database. And I think this opens a lot of opportunities for automated treatment of this data. And the idea is that you could automatically treat this data so that to automatically calculate the quantity of allowances that an importer would need to surrender. And I'm not exactly saying that that it would be simple. But I am saying that it's actually simpler from an administrative point of view than I would have originally imagined. So this is the concept. But I need to, just as a conclusion, I would like to first re-emphasize that this is indeed the objective is not to give EU producers a competitive advantage. This is not what this is about. This is really about equal treatment between EU producers and importers, and making sure that they're on a equal footing, and creating an incentives for importers to reduce their carbon intensity in case they don't have such incentives in their home country. Now, this may not be appropriate for all sectors. We have started working with different sectors, and we find that if you're looking at something which is very commoditized, sorry. If it's simple, if it's standard, then it works pretty well. As soon as it starts getting the product is a little complicated, then it's a lot more difficult. So there's definitely more work to be done, especially on complex products. However, we feel that for certain sectors, it would be appropriate, and it could fit within a more general approach for Hector Pollitt mentioned that you need policies that are targeted to each sector, and what the work we've done definitely has made us come to the same conclusion, that you need to have policies which are to prevent carbon leakage that are really tailor-made to each sector. It's definitely not one size fits all in that sense. But really, what I would like to conclude on is that we do not wish to implement such a border adjustment measures. Ideally, as Graham mentioned, we could have a perfect international agreement, and then we wouldn't need to implement such a scheme. And clearly, that's not going to happen for a moment. But alternatively, what we're hoping for is that we could have satisfactory sectoral agreement as the best way to prevent carbon leakage. And this is very important to us because today in Durban, we're discussing new market-based mechanism in the context of the LCA track of negotiations. And new market-based mechanism could open the way for sectoral crediting and trading. And the EU has made very clear that it strongly supports such such sectoral mechanisms. And so in the short term, I definitely hope that by the end of the week we can come to a decision on opening the way for those new market-based mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Diane. I'm sure we'll get some interest, responsive questions from the audience on that. I hope that was clear. I don't see anyone burning to sort of say, I didn't understand what French are saying. That will make an interesting platform for the discussion. We have two commentators, and I would like to move now on to them. The first is Doha Abdul-Muttal from the World Trade Organization. Doha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here with you. Yet another conference of the parties, yet another continent, and not so much progress, unfortunately. And I think as we keep on moving from one conference of the parties to another and from one continent to another with very little progress, the issue of unilateral measures grows. Hence the importance of the issue of trade measures and response measures more generally at this conference relative to other conferences of the parties. This isn't necessarily a criticism of the UNFCCC process. I work for the World Trade Organization, where our negotiations are just as slow and just as problematic. I think this is unfortunately just a feature of what's happening today, where multilateralism is struggling. In terms of, I'm just a discussant, so let me make a few comments on what the others have said and situate this debate in sort of a broader context. I think there are several motivations, let's say, for unilateral action. The more the international agreement drags its feet, the more it's impossible to reach an equitable international accord, the more some countries are deciding to take matters into their own hands to protect our climate. Now, some think we should be grateful for that. There are at least some countries that are moving and that are taking action, but there are others that are saying, wait a second, it's okay for them to take action, provided it doesn't affect me. And that's where the problem of border measures comes in. Now, the countries that are considering themselves to be first movers on climate change, movers ahead of a global international treaty, are saying what you just heard from France. There's a problem of leakage. There's an environmental concern, which is that us acting alone may not be sufficient to address what is a global environmental problem. Hence, the need for us to take measures at the border to penalize imports, if you will, if they have a high carbon content. Otherwise, we would simply be consuming the emissions that we have succeeded in reducing at home. So there is that environmental concern. There is also an undeniable competitiveness concern, which we can't brush under the rug. It's a concern, it's there. Many industries that are subject to mitigation action in those parts of the world that consider themselves to be first movers are lobbying very heavily for their global competitors to have their global competitors also be subjected to equivalent action. So there is certainly a competitiveness dimension to this. On the environmental argument, let me just say that there is a lot more evidence on the table today relative to 1 or 2 years ago, I would say, on the extent of the imported emissions by developed countries, the extent of the importation of emissions, if you will, that is actually taking place. And I think that evidence is alarming. It shows that, that some developed countries that have succeeded in reducing the emissions they are producing are actually importing quite a lot of emissions in the products that they are importing. And I think the more that body of evidence grows, the more the issue of border measures is going to grow too. Because nobody is going to endure what is a serious economic sacrifice at home in order to reduce emissions, simply to find those emissions being imported from elsewhere. In fact, a lot of work is now being done on what is now starting to be labeled a CO2 subsidy, if you will, from the developing world to the developed. Somewhat along the lines of what, Graham, you have also spoken about earlier. Now, in this conference, you will find that trade measures are being discussed under the heading of response measures. They're also being discussed in a number of other sections of this negotiation, shared vision, and so on. But broadly speaking, they fall under the title of response measures. Now, the idea of response measures was built into the treaty by initially Saudi Arabia, that wanted compensation for the impact of a global climate accord on its economy. But it's now become a sort of catch-all umbrella window in the negotiation through which the developing world in particular is interested in addressing the climate mitigation action that the developed world is taking and how it may be impacted by that action. There is language on the table that countries are looking at, which mostly the developing world has crafted, which calls upon developed countries to refrain from taking unilateral measures that would impact developing countries, even if those measures are taken to address leakage. And I have the exact language with me if you need it at a later point. Now, there is an Indian proposal that's being discussed in Durban that takes that language even further to completely ban the right of developed countries to take unilateral actions that may impact developing countries. In addition, under response measures, with respect to trade, the trade response measures, there's a discussion going on as to what forum is the appropriate forum for the discussion of trade and climate change linkages, with many developing countries saying we need to create that forum here in the UNFCCC, and many developed countries saying no, that forum should be the WTO. The Indian proposal banning the right of countries to use unilateral measures to address climate change is a proposal that would change rights and obligations under the rules of the World Trade Organization, and that's where that proposal should be discussed. So there is a fight also taking place around where the appropriate forum is for the discussion of this linkage. Now, in my opinion, and to wrap up, I'm just a discussant, this is a problem that will grow. This is not a problem that is likely to go away, despite all the discussion and the effort and the number of people who are here in Durban to discuss exclusively those response measures. This problem will not go away because we are in the unusual situation where the first commitment period is coming to an end. We have very little information about a second commitment period, and even if we were to have information, we're not quite clear on what would happen to the US and China relative to that second commitment period. So we are in a treaty context where the rights and obligations are totally unclear going forward, and we are now multilaterally discussing how to manage the unilateral response, which is a very awkward situation to be in. So this problem will not go away until rights and obligations are properly established in this treaty. I think what has happened in the aviation sector is a case in point with the EU's inclusion of international aviation in its domestic aviation scheme. And what I was telling a number of negotiators last night is that the more the issue of where should we have a forum in which to discuss the relationship between trade and climate change, the more that discussion is prolonged, the longer it takes, the more the world will create a forum wherever that forum may be in order to address the problem at hand. In aviation, we saw 3 US airlines seize the European Court of Justice to challenge the EU scheme. We saw them seize the General Assembly of the International Civil Aviation Organization to adopt a resolution condemning the extraterritorial nature of the EU aviation scheme, although a non-binding resolution. So responses to response measures will be there. But it is unfortunate that those responses find their way into courts and move into a dispute settlement track as opposed to a proper discussion, whether here or at the WTO. The WTO is certainly, the World Trade Organization is certainly open to having a discussion on trade and climate change, contrary to some statements that I've heard made at this conference over the past week. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dar. A very interesting take on the dynamics of where these issues are going. Our final panellist is Edward Batten from the World Steel Association. Edward, please. Edwin, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as you've heard, I'm Edwin Basson. I'm with the World Steel Association. We represent about 75% of all steel that is produced in the world today. And just for a reference, the steel market today is about 1,400 million tons per annum. This is steel produced and traded on a global basis. Also, steel finds itself in this debate normally at both ends of the spectrum. At one end, we are seen as a producer of carbon, and that is true. We are, in the industry environment, a producer of carbon, not the largest, but large enough to at least make a mark on all of the graphs that are produced. On the other hand, of this 1.4 million tons of steel that is produced annually and consumed annually, roughly 2/3 at any point in its life crosses an international border. So this whole debate around trade is quite important for us in terms of how to go forward. And this is a little bit where I'm now where I have to think as a businessman. My fear that I have is we are building more and more complex structures that makes it more and more difficult for business to do normal trade. And I wonder sometimes if it is not because we are thinking of carbon as something different than all other products. What we are essentially talking about is a resource, just like we can talk about raw materials or water or anything else as a resource. And what the world is struggling with today is a way to find a policy or an approach to get an efficient resource allocation between countries and between utilizations. Now, how to solve this issue? At one end, you can increase the availability of this resource, of your right to emit carbon, by having lower emissions. And in the steel industry, we have a very strong four-pillar approach on how to do. One is we commit ourselves to reducing carbon emissions. Secondly, we are saying that where we have better technologies, let's go through the process of transfer of best technology everywhere in the world so that we can get everybody on the same efficient platform. Thirdly, we do need breakthrough technologies to reduce our carbon emissions even more. And fourthly, we believe in the use phase of steel, there are significant opportunities on how to reduce carbon emissions. There is a study done by a very large consulting house, for instance, in the German environment, that indicates quite clearly that by focusing on the use phase of steel in 5 key sectors that are also carbon emitting sectors, and by making sure that the modern steels that we are able to produce today is used to the best advantage in the use phase in the final technologies, you can release or abate carbon emissions in the use phase substantially more than the overall emissions coming from the steel sector in the production of this phase. So I think there are huge opportunities, and this to some extent links to what Graham have mentioned when he showed this a very interesting slide of importing and exporting of carbon. It also links to the whole trade issue, which we've heard about, where I think you made the point of a carbon subsidy from developing to developed nations. And clearly, we can go through very complex routes to try and prevent material from crossing borders, but that will not succeed, because the fact that the material crosses the border today means that there is a need for something on the other side of the border, and therefore the material crosses the border. And trade will continue. It's been continuing for mankind's existence. It will continue to go forward. So the key is then, how do we try and bring some reduced complexity into this trade process, particularly as far as is concerned with carbon? And I'm just wondering in the back of my mind, if we were to, as a society, begin to focus on ways to price carbon properly, whether it is through a tax or through a market price mechanism, and you build that price into your product, same as you would be building the price of iron ore or electricity or whatever else today into your product, then we are sitting with a body of trade mechanisms that are working for products today, that are dealing with differences in prices for raw materials between different parts of the world. And in a way we can simplify this trade complexity, not by making more rules, but by making fewer rules and probably focusing on the one true issue that we are all worrying about, and that is how to price carbon properly, how to price it effectively, and how to make sure that you have, through the way we produce products, through the way we use products in the use phase, reduce our emissions throughout the process. And in a way, I'm pleading as a businessman that we should try and look for simpler solutions constantly, rather than for more complex solutions. And I think if we use our combined energies in that direction, maybe we'll move forward faster. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you indeed. Very, very interesting set of comments we've had. So thank you. Let me, if I may, just offer two comments and then turn to the floor. One, I just want to stress, I suspect many here may recognise this. There is still a sort of academic debate about whether really carbon leakage matters. The numbers are relatively small, etc. I think if one actually looks at the real world, you conclude carbon leakage matters. It matters a lot. It is affecting the design of every emissions trading scheme or pricing scheme that has ever been considered that's moved within any distance close to implementation. It's occupied unbelievable amounts of time and energy of people trying to negotiate those systems. The outcome has tended to be a mix of various complicated forms of free allocation for particular periods that I increasingly feel many of those involved simply cannot last forever, and that we cannot solve the problem by simply trying to exempt anything that threatens to move. So this is an issue that matters, whatever the aggregate numbers is 1 or 2% of global emissions, etc., etc. And I think most people that are operating with the real policy developments would recognise that. No politician that I've ever seen is willing to stand up and say, well, you know what, we've got this scheme, great scheme, it's going to save the planet. We'll lose some jobs, and by the way, those industries will go abroad and still emit just as much, if not more. It's just really, really bad politics. So action will be taken one sort or another, and in a sense, the holding pattern first step has been free allowances in some pretty messy ways. Second is that insofar as there are better approaches, in Climate Strategies, the organisation I chair, I did a lot of screening, scoping, analytic, numerical work, and looking at the options. And the simplest way of summarising the simplest conclusion was it has to be sector-specific. Trade is sector-specific. Trade rules are applied in sector-specific contexts. And the politics of that are quite interesting. A couple of years ago, I had some conversations with the Australian government about their design, and I said that, and they said, that's really, really difficult, Michael. I mean, the fact is we just need a kind of one-size-fits-all solution to the carbon leakage. And then a little bit later, I had a conversation with Diana Rosengarten, who was the chief political strategist for Senator Lieberman around the wax remarketing, etc. And I said, you know, actually I've got some probably rather bad news for you, that actually I think any sensible approach to this is going to have to be sector-specific. Why do you think that's a problem? What do you think Washington is? It's just a series of sectoral negotiations. I slightly suspect, having observed the last 2 years in Australia, the Australians may have moved a little to the view that you have to reach any solution in sector-specific ways. I won't speculate on where the EU is on that, but I think I can guess where it will end up. Okay, so I just wanted to offer those two, if you like, framing comments. What I'd like to do in the rest of this session, and we've actually been reasonably well endowed, if I've understood my guidance, that we have something close to 40 minutes. We've got a lot of smart and informed people in the audience. What I would like to do is suggest we run it as follows. I'd like to see a show of hands of people who've got questions. If it's manageable, I will try and take a group of questions. I then want to do a small polling test on a few key things of questions of my own with the audience. And then, if we can, fashion the final part around Brendan Vickers' questions, if that's acceptable, a little bit of structure in the rest of this session. So, can I ask for a show of hands? Okay, that's manageable. I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and a very bright light in my eye. Can we take them in that order, please? And then also, panel, please note, I'll take all 4 questions at once. I think, Tom, we're starting with you.
Thank you. Tom Dorff, the Schiller Foundation Research Fellow in Germany currently. I've been struggling a little with the forum problem. I frankly don't consider it the most important problem, but I think it is certainly an important one. And I have counted no fewer than 7 international agencies with analytic expertise and some negotiating experience who would have a legitimate claim to be included in some kind of, I'm going to call it a consortium for lack of a better word. And my question is, for any of you or all of you, of the following 7 plus 8, which is other, if you were going to form a forum to address the offsetting border measures issues in particular, which of the following would you include? The WTO, the FCCC, the World Bank, UNCTAD, the OECD, UNEP, and the IPCC, and or other?
IPCC or ITCC?
IPCC.
Right. Thanks for this very interesting panel. I want to follow up a little bit on Michael's... Sorry, Harry van Asselt, University of Oxford. I want to follow up a little bit on Michael's last comment related to the politics of designing measures to address leakage. And this, I feel, is a little bit under-discussed in general. And if you look at the EU ETS history so far, on how verification rules were established, also, and I think Hector mentioned that the coverage of leakage or sectors at risk of leakage under the EU ETS currently is heavily influenced by the policy-making process and the access to data of policymakers. How would you assure that any border adjustment measure or any other measure addressing leakage actually take into account let's say, the state of research in an objective, independent perspective? And here, I maybe also address this question to the ones in climate strategies who were involved in a lot of reporting on leakage even before the EU ETS revisions came into force. So maybe you can talk about this from a personal perspective as well.
Thank you, Chair. It is Canan Derin Özgencel from the Turkish Cement Manufacturers Association. Turkish Cement Manufacturers Association. I have 2 questions for Ms. Simu, Mr. Basin, and Ms. Ratal. My first question is this French proposal. Is this a EU-wide proposal by French, or is it just for France also? What is the position of the European Cement Manufacturers Association to this proposal? And is this in compliance with the WTO rules? And my second question is for Mr. Besson. If he had, which one is the steel industry prefer, a sectoral approach or a French proposal-based approach for their own industry? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Marcus Gehring from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. I had a question for Diane and one for Doha. Diane, the proposal, which I personally think is a great one, especially the practical side of it, has to be, of course, a European-wide scheme because France has no more competence to enact those on-the-border measures. But I was wondering whether the French government was considering something that, in my view, is quite successful in the aviation ETS directive, to have an exemption for producers from least developed countries, for producers from certain regions of the world. And I was wondering whether that has been considered. And then the question that Aaron raised in the previous session, or the concern that ISD expressed, was the worst thing is probably to send these proposals down the WTO dispute settlement route. I was just wondering whether there are opinions in the Secretariat, the Trade and Environment section, how those dispute decisions, which way those dispute decisions could go, because in my view, it's probably not a very clear-cut, black and white issue, as many might hope, because that's what you get if you fail to negotiate and you submit yourself to the courts.
Okay, great. So questions on forums, at least 7. How to insulate systems from politics and decisions based on notice. Research, thank you. Possibly a subject dear to my heart. French proposal, is it actually an EU proposal heading that way or not? And various aspects of whether it's compliant with WTO. I'd be delighted, Dora, if you can give us a firm legal ruling on that question. And the steel applications, and then some further dimensions of the French proposal, possibly borrowing some of the ideas from aviation and the issues around the legal forum. Maybe simplest, since a considerable amount was not surprisingly, the last 2 was addressed to the French proposal. Could we just, for sheer random convenience, start at the far end of the table and work our way back to the speaker, the chair? Diane, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all of your very interesting questions. Maybe I'll start with your questions, madam. First of all, is it French? Is it European? So, in order to clarify, the French proposal would need to be applied at an EU scale, because the EU ETS is EU-wide, and because the customs system is very much integrated. So it wouldn't make sense to apply it at the French borders. It wouldn't work, and we wouldn't even want to try that. So at this stage, it's a French proposal. We've had interest from some other member states. I think as we're there will be further discussion, depending on the outcome of the international negotiations. There will be further discussions linked to whether we decide to move to a more ambitious target, moving beyond 20% to a reduction of 25 or 30%. This is going to come up again in EU discussions. Not that it's ever really gone away, but you also asked about the position of EU cement manufacturers. One thing I can tell you for sure is that this has received a lot of support from French cement manufacturers. I understand that it has had a good reception with EU cement manufacturers, although I don't think they've put out anything publicly for that matter. Yeah, your third question was about whether it could be compliant with WTO rules. So I'm sure, Doha will have a final statement on this. No, I'm kidding. But what we have found working with our WTO experts is that this very much depends on how the scheme is designed. And the way that we have it conceived is that it would be the importers would rather be treated better than the EU manufacturers, because if you don't have any information about their emissions, then they would be treated as EU average, which is quite favorable treatment. And in that sense, you couldn't say that it gives you it gives EU manufacturers an advantage. So in that respect, we think that it could be designed in such a way that is compliant with WTO rules. Then maybe I can address your question about exemptions for least developed countries. You mentioned that it was the case for the aviation ETS, which is not quite correct. There are no exemptions for least developed countries. There are countries where if you don't have if the commercial operators don't have a lot of flights to and from that country, to and from Europe, then they would be exempted.
And where they're from? Most of them are from these developed.
Indeed, but that's like 98 countries that are not, 98 countries have no, their commercial operators are not included in the ETS, but that's because they fall below a de minimis level. However, that's indeed a very interesting idea. This is something that we've been considering in the French proposal. We don't have a final position on this, but I think something to keep in mind is it's the same for, it's really a case that this would not, the way that this is designed is really the objective is to ensure that EU producers and importers alike are able to pass through the cost of the emissions emitted in the production of the product through to the consumer. And so in the end, it would be the European consumer who pays the price of these allowances. It would never be the importer, you know, whether from a least developing country, from a developed country, that would pay that cost. It would be, in the end, it would be the European consumer. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you very much.
I think there was, let me start with a question from the lady from the Turkish Cement Association. The question was, what would I prefer as a steel industry? Would I prefer the French proposal or a sectoral approach? If I was a Frenchman or maybe a European steel producer, clearly I think I would have preferred the French proposal. If, however, I was a Chinese producer or maybe an American producer or a South African producer, I would have had some question marks around this. And this brings me to some extent also a little bit to the trouble with trying to get a unique one-size-fits-all sectoral approach or sectoral solution, is because you have these vast differences in a global industry like ours, and probably in yours as well. And in the end, if you come up with a sectoral approach, it's quite possible that you might end up with something that is so bland, because it has to fit all the different positions, that it doesn't mean anything. Now, I've just spent some time earlier today in the business day where the question was to business what to do about this whole environmental issue. And the answer that came out there was actually quite positive. It was, on the one end, every crisis has an opportunity. And they called it a crisis purely because they were saying this thing is going nowhere. Yes, we have all these promises. Maybe there will be some commitment to something after KP and so forth. But as businessmen, let's not worry about that. Every crisis has its opportunity. What is the opportunity? The opportunity is to grow your economy or grow your business in terms of products, solutions, applications that fits the new sustainable picture. And we've referred to that earlier today, is that if you are beginning to think about sustainability, then that creates in itself tremendous opportunities for business, and no less for steel or cement, whichever sector you would like to look at. Which brings me a little bit to the question of someone that asked if there were 7 agencies, which is the one that can talk about trade principles. It just brings me back to this principle and saying, let us please not make things so complex that we cannot go forward and capitalize on these tremendous opportunities that might sit in solving this challenge of a sustainable future society. Let us focus on what can be done and what can be done sensibly. And there, I think Graham also mentioned in his presentation, he had 3 requirements, 2 or 3 principles for border mechanisms. And I'm now using the term border mechanisms in its widest possible sense, whether it's trade or border mechanisms or carbon leakage mechanisms or whatever. He said that it should have equivalent coverage. In other words, it should be fairly broad ranged. It should have mutual recognition. And it should be non-discriminatory. I think if we try whatever we do in terms of regulation, whether it is regulation around carbon leakage, whether it's regulation about making sure that embodied carbon crosses across the border at some pre-agreed price, whatever we do, let's try and keep to these 3 principles, because I think that's the right principle. Because then we can have a competitive society that can use its energy to focus at the future sustainable solution.
Thank you. And Dor.
Thank you. Tom, to your question on fora, you mentioned a number of them, and I think all of them obviously have a lot of expertise in the issue we're discussing. My understanding of what's happening here, but I stand to be corrected from any delegates that are here, is that the problem that is under discussion, under negotiation here, does not have to do with expertise per se. In other words, countries here are not disagreeing on where that forum should be because they would like the WTO Secretariat to help them if this discussion were to take place in the WTO, or they would like the UNFCCC Secretariat to help them and to bring expertise if this discussion were to take place here. I don't think that the question of expertise is what worries them. When they talk about a forum, they're very much looking at a place where the countries themselves can have a discussion. But the problem, I think, comes from the fact that the place determines the legal implications of the discussion and determines the amount of flexibility or lack thereof that you can have in the discussion. So developed countries would like the discussion to take place in the WTO, so they bring it closer to the rules, contain it, and have a more accurate rules-based dialogue with whatever country is involved. That would be involved. Developing countries want more flexibility in that dialogue than what WTO rules would bring, and hence they don't want the WTO umbrella. They want to stretch, in fact, potentially WTO rules without having to formally say so at the WTO through some decision here. So it's more, I think those are more the issues that are at play in the negotiation on what forum. On the legality of the French scheme, dispute settlement in the WTO, would border measures be accepted or would they be condemned? I think the devil pretty much lies in the detail. You've heard the view of one of our members, France, on the compatibility of the French scheme with WTO rules. There are some WTO members who would argue that it is incompatible. I think it will very much depend on the details of the mechanism when a case, or if a case is to be brought to the WTO. It would also depend on who the judges are in a panel, who, as you know, are selected on a case-by-case basis, but also who the permanent members of our appellate body are, and how green that composition is of appellate body members, if you will.
A useful real-world check about how the world works there. Thank you. Hector.
Thank you. I'm going to, I think, possibly wrap 3 of the questions into one answer and possibly not provide a straight answer to any of them, so I'm sorry about that. A lot of the discussion has been about carbon leakage, border adjustment mechanisms, and market-based instruments in general. And sometimes we can get a bit carried away from that, and a lot of the questions have brought us back to that the institutional framework is very important for all of this. And we've been thinking, what do we want to get from this framework? And two things have come out in particular. The framework the institution should be enabling us to move forwards, not working against each other. And the complexity of it needs to be as low as possible. I think that was a very good point, more than once. So, an example of that was, as I said on the slides, that carbon leakage, although it's a problem for some sectors, at the macro level, the impacts were smaller, did not mean from that the conclusion should be therefore it doesn't matter, because we don't live within that institutional framework. And I think it's absolutely right to emphasise that. So, coming into the questions, the forum, which one should it be? When you asked the question, I thought it was a very good question, but I predicted you would get 0 answers that were definitive.
Think about border mechanisms in whatever form they may take. We're thinking about it because carbon pricing is unequal, and it's unequal in certain sectors. That immediately constrains our range of options of where it's going to be implemented and what sectors it could potentially be implemented on. On the state of research and bringing research into the process, I'd separate that out into data and design. And when I say data, I mean the sorts of numbers, the type of analysis that I was showing at the start of my presentation, where, yes, it's easy to say more research is needed, but actually, is it? It's nice to have more up-to-date figures. Since that work has been done, there's been some time series come out using similar types of approaches, looking at a time series of how these flows change internationally over time, etc. But we're not using that data itself to operationalise border mechanisms. We're using that to rationalise and understand and conceptualise what the issue is, and on the basis of that, decide whether to move forward, and having made that decision, how. And I don't see the data shifting that much that it's changing those very early decisions. On design, yes, that's much more where current thinking it's necessary to bring that into the discussions, because as I alluded to on my last slide, there are many different ways in which this could be approached, and they do have very different outcomes. There is only, from a European perspective, a consumption-based ETS mechanism is the only one that actually delivers a guaranteed environmental outcome. It's also the one that's not going to happen. It's politically untenable. But it's the only one that will actually guarantee an environmental objective is met. The rest of them will deliver some environmental objective at some price point. And it's that sort of thing. It's understanding those trade-offs as to what design delivers you, what sort of outcome, what is it that you're actually looking for. That's where I think current academic thinking and research has got its involvement. I was going to tackle one other question as well, Michael. I think it was Marcus asking about exemptions for LDCs, and I'm not familiar with the aviation example. Just to play devil's advocate, is it really to their advantage? Because you're assuming that they have no competitive advantage. So if these sectors in LDCs were actually lower carbon than the destination economies for their products, and you're excluding them from that process, then you're preventing them from gaining additional value from the fact that they are low carbon. Low carbon by circumstance or low carbon by design because it's most recent plant and it's best in class, etc. Taking this all one step further, there are revenues involved. You could see some of those revenues being recycled into some sort of international innovation scheme mechanism for the sector. So we've excluded some countries from this process, therefore we're going to exclude them from any revenue recycling which may appear in the form of innovation support, therefore they're going to be left behind as the industry goes forward. Now, I'm speaking from a position of lack of knowledge, but I'm just saying it's not to me quite as clear-cut that LDC will benefit from exclusion.
All right. Thank you, Graham. Okay, I've seen that there's at least one question that I may have missed earlier. It's another at the back. So what I'd like to do is I just want to offer comment on one of the questions that was raised, the final one about role of research, then the issue I touched on, and then we'll come back to the questions. And so there's opportunity for the audience, and Klaus, sorry if I missed you first time round. Just on the role of research, if people will forgive me, I think a little tale, and apologies for sort of inevitably slight personal experience slant on this, but it does, I think, say something about this challenge. Climate Strategies is an international research network organisation, and based broadly in Europe, did some work about 5 years ago, initially on allocation under the ETS, and then the British government came to us and said, that was a really interesting piece of work. Said we were wanting to be policy relevant drawing on academia, if you like, was the tag, and they said, we think you should work on competitiveness. And to my huge embarrassment, I will confess that I said, I don't really think there's any very interesting stuff to do on competitiveness. We've had 10 years of economic models, all showing that the impact is going to be substantially less than 1% of GDP, etc., etc. And they said, no, that's not the point. Every day we are being beaten up by energy-intensive industries about the competitiveness impact, and we haven't a clue whether to believe what they're telling us. I'm being very indiscreet here. I do apologise. We'd like Climate Strategies to actually do some serious analytic work using the best academic thinking, etc., to try and look at this. So I said, okay, all right. And so we turned through, we cried through. We then discovered that whenever British business was coming to the government to complain about this, they said, go and talk to Climate Strategies, which put us in a rather interesting position and learned the hard way what sort of doing research with strong stakeholder input is like. And that came out with a study which scoped out your carbon exposure per value added, etc. And I think it's fair to say that also had a fairly good impact. And then discovered the British government was actually using that quite extensively, standing up and saying, oh, look at this chart, Climate Strategies have shown that competitiveness is not a problem. Which actually wasn't quite what we'd said. What we'd said is, there's about half a dozen sectors which make a limited contribution to gross value added, but which are a real problem because, in part, no country wants to lose those, and because of the environmental consequences of migration. But anyway, that all sort of worked its way through, and some of that analysis is quite well, I think, known, and I think has helped to establish at least a better understanding about the sectoral issues and some of the options. Why do I tell you that tale? Well, I think one thing is academics don't actually always know what the important questions are. Sometimes we do need governments to tell us what is the real problems they're facing. Second, almost anything that academics do will be subject to a degree of spin. And no point in griping about it, that's the nature of the world, and the academics need to stay involved to say, well, actually, kind of really what we were saying is this. Third thing, it has to be multilateral. We were a pan-European research, we had experts in 4 or 5 European countries based on this, and it assumed a degree of sort of credibility which would have been impossible if it had come from one country at a European level issue. The fourth was, it's hard work, it takes a long time, but in my view it's worth it because it really does establish a body of work that then, if you grind it through enough and have enough conversations, does become acknowledged and helps then the debate move on to a next phase. So I think, don't be naive about what academia can offer. It's not going to help solve most of the world's big political problems, but it maybe can help at least make progress. And I think we may, there's lots more it would be interesting to try and do in similar ways with some of our collaborators. Now, I'd said there were a couple of questions I wanted to fly back at the audience, maybe to liven things up a little bit. I've no idea if this is going to be of any interest. This is a highly unrepresentative sample of the people in Durban. But nevertheless, I'll try and we'll see. I'm a little curious at the following questions. How many people actually think that some form of border adjustment may be acceptable? Okay, I wasn't sure the panel would want to, but okay, okay, right. I'm going to be a little mean about this. I counted in advance. We had about 48 people in the room, and a rough guesstimate, that means about 30 of them or more think that no, if you want to take it literally, no form of border adjustment would be acceptable. How many people that think that countries could or should be expected to take responsibility for the consumption carbon footprint? To some degree, not in total, not in all bells and whistles. Okay, fairly, somewhat more. You'd be surprised how many people say absolutely never to the first one and absolutely yes to the second, without knowing that I've basically asked the same question in different ways. How many people are from countries that have excise duties on petroleum? Sorry, maybe this is a very English term. How many countries, people are from countries that tax petroleum, gasoline? Yeah, be very surprised if there weren't any hands. Even the US does actually tax gasoline to some degree. You'll see why I'm asking these. How many people are from countries that have some system of value-added taxation? Okay. I should say, if any US citizens have put their hands up, you don't know your own tax system, but almost everybody else does, as far as I'm aware. Apologies to the tax expert. Why do I say this? Well, because excise duties in petroleum, as far as I'm aware, every country that has a tax on petroleum taxes imports. It's a border adjustment. And frankly, it's a border adjustment of almost exactly the same structure that in our research we proposed for cement. There's virtually no legal difference identifiable. Now, the value-added tax is a lot more complicated, but it's something closer to implicit in a carbon-based consumption program that you have to tax carbon across the borders and add up the carbon at stages of production. But the point is VAT is also a border adjustment. We have about 130 countries now that have signed up to VAT. So I don't know if anybody wants to change their answer to the first one, but the fact is that everybody who said border adjustments should never be acceptable are in countries that already do border adjustments. They just do it with things other than carbon. So the question that I would put back to you is, why do you think it's reasonable to do it for petroleum but not for cement? And why do you think it's reasonable to do taxation on value added but not on carbon added? That, to my mind, is the structurally logical question that needs to be addressed if we're going to have a really sort of grounded, sensible and somewhat less politicised debate, which is not going to be easy, let's face it. And there may be good answers to that, but I'm just saying, you know, let's try and get away from some of this rhetoric. Look at what we already do in the area of border adjustments, why it is considered acceptable, and whether those criteria can also be brought to bear on the carbon challenge. I have to say, I stressed that a little because, frankly, I am extremely pessimistic that we will ever solve this problem if any region that wants to be try to be more ambitious is expected to basically have policies which discriminate against their own producers in favour of importers, which is ultimately what will be proposed by the absence of any border anything implied. Okay, I'd love to try that with a sort of, you know, full cop, but I doubt I'll never get the chance. Okay. Now, could we return to the audience for a more normal pattern of questions from the floor? Klaus, I believe you had a question.
Thank you, Mark. I will speak up. Perhaps it's not so much a question, but simply share some views with us. I feel the discussion is very interesting, and I like, of course, the suggestion to have a simple system Edwin proposed, and we also wanted to have a simple system, but if you look on how the shadow price is valued in various countries, you will find it's not so easy. The US has $20 in that range, UK £60 in that range, and Scandinavian countries even higher, 80 euros or something like that. So I feel it would be very difficult to get any agreement on that. And my second observation is that when the emissions trading was introduced, various sectors have been asked in Brussels whether they want to support it or not. It was up to the discretion of the sectors to agree or not to agree. And the steel sector agreed, power sector agreed, cement agreed, only chemical industry disagreed. Therefore, they were not addressed in the first round. And my second last point is that unfortunately we don't have so much time left. What science says is a matter of urgency to address now climate change in order to avoid much higher costs later. Because what might be too much in the atmosphere will have to be addressed by so-called overshooting scenarios, which are very expensive to suck out the CO2 from the atmosphere, take it out of the carbon cycle. And this brings me to my last point, that the problem with the carbon price, with the fixed one, is that it will have to be rather progressive. So we will have continuing negotiations how much to increase it per year. It would be really a challenge, a political challenge, to have such kind of an increasing price. So I feel that the carbon market, if it is well designed, is a really viable option. And I know from China, they are also now thinking about introducing carbon trading domestically, and I see more systems coming like Australia and in parts of the US.
I think that we need it there because our time is limited. Was there another question Was another question in the audience? Yes, at the back, towards the back there.
Maybe just while we get that question, let me just quickly remark on the remark. I think you're absolutely right. The issue is not to try and complicate the system further. The problem that we have is that we have a carbon taxing mechanism in one country and not in other countries. And eventually what we need to be aware of is, in due course, if we agree this is the right thing to do, and I think this is the logical thing to go for, is to have a range of carbon pricing options, whether it's tax or pricing. Eventually all of this has to be market-based pricing, so the natural arbitrage between different regions can begin to take place. And at that point, carbon will be priced like any other commodity. And then we can dispense with a lot of the fluff that we have at the moment and really get going and making business. And business in a way where we can focus on a future sustainable society with carbon priced at the correct price by region.
And at the back, I think was Sukajusan?
Yes, my name is Jose Asuka, Tohoku University in Japan, IGES. Maybe related to previous question, then question to Ms. Diana Sim. The question about the implementation, as the previous speaker said, that there's many carbon market emerging in the world. So they have paid, for example, China may introduce and they have some carbon price. And so how do you take care of those kind of double payment? One country have already paid some carbon price, and how much price might be different. Some carbon price in the Chinese market would be very expensive or very cheap, and also Australian market, they're paying some very high. So how do you reconcile that kind of double payment issue? Also, in addition to that, some countries expose, governments implementing export tax or those kind of things for heavy energy investment products. So how do you think that kind of trade-related product regulation by host countries? Thank you.
Okay, we've collected a lot of interesting issues over the time. I will just remind us also of Brendan's opening questions, then just check if there's issues the panel wants to pick up. I don't want to run right through the panel because we've really only got a couple of minutes left. Brendan's additional questions was, in addition, is there a role for border measures? What alternative tools exist? How to best measure embodied carbon? And is the concept of embodied carbon or the practice of border measures compatible with trade? And I think we've kind of got answers on the first and last of those. If we can get definitive answers to the others and everything else that's been raised in the next 2 minutes, that would be brilliant. Anyone want to take the challenge? Or other comments on those questions, including Dr. Jewson?
Can you
Brendan.
maybe just repeat the questions in the middle? You said we have an answer for the first and the last, but the others I can't remember.
What alternative tools exist to present carbon leakage, and how best to measure embodied carbon in traded goods? I'm not actually proposing that we try and answer all of those in the 2 minutes left. But.
Yeah, no, I think just maybe one remark about carbon leakage. I think it is, in a way, a disappearing problem. If one assumes that trade with embodied carbon will continue to take place, then this is I think it's a term which we are spending a lot of energy about at the moment, because we have differential pricing systems of carbon. So I wonder whether the solution is to try and spend too much time on carbon leakage as a topic, or whether we should begin to say, is there a different way of beginning to think about pricing of carbon? And that in itself will take the carbon leakage question out of the way.
Let me try very briefly. What alternative tools are there to border measures? Well, an international treaty where all major emitters take serious obligations. So there would be no need to, it would obviate the need for corrective action at the border. Alternative tools in a world where you don't have an international treaty that embraces all major polluters would be what the idea that Europe has toyed with, which is free allocation. And in fact, before the EU Parliament, the EU Commissioner for Trade has often said, wait, you're asking me for border measures? Well, you're already getting free allowances. So I think to the mind of the Commission, to some extent, free allowances were given so that there would be no need for border measures. Now, in the aviation sector, we saw free allocation plus, well, would you call them border measures, plus the inclusion of imports, so international aviation, into the EU emissions trading scheme. So we've seen both. It's an evolving debate.
Okay, I need to draw this session to close. We're actually bang on time. I must, however, thank all the panelists, all the speakers, and should, without wishing to discriminate in favour of climate strategies, particularly thank Graham, who perhaps did the most to pull this session together, along with Cambridge Econometrics, Hector and your colleagues. And thank you all for coming and staying, and I hope you found that an interesting session. Thank you very much.